I am a history teacher, and this will be our classroom. So, how about we, the people, learn this stuff together? Welcome back to US 101. There's the bell, and let's get to that. I missed the theme song, man. Newsflash, ladies and gentlemen, American classrooms, specifically American history classrooms, are under attack.
All over the country, beginning early last June, school curricula have changed completely and become explicitly political and openly racist.
This is where angry parents are accusing the school board of trying to indoctrinate students with controversial curriculum on race and American history.
People, the children are being indoctrinated in history classrooms all across the country because teachers have the gall to teach something called
critical race theory.
Critical race theory.
Critical race theory.
Critical race theory.
Critical race theory are the buzzwords being bandied about the political landscape these days in the hopes of riling up Americans to back the beliefs of one side of the aisle or the other. On the left, you have historians, scholars, academics defending critical race theory being taught in classrooms because they believe that it will provide students with a much broader picture when it comes to American history that is much more inclusive of other people that are usually left out of the traditional narrative. Additionally, it is their belief that critical race theory will help to teach students that racism is in fact a social construct and that elements of racism are baked within the systems and policies of the United States. Now, on the right, the words critical race theory conjure up scenes of classrooms where students are beholden to the whims of a teacher who is there to tell them that white people are evil, all the ills of the nation are solely because of white people, and that the United States of America is a terrible country. And the belief that critical race theory is nothing more than a method of indoctrination has picked up a lot of steam in some states, particularly red states in the US. So much so that legislation has passed in states like Florida, which have now expressly banned critical race theory from being taught in classrooms. Now, I know it's summer vacation, there's no school happening in the United States right now, and this should not really be a topic of discussion that we talk about in the summer. Who wants to talk about things that are happening in the classroom when the classroom is not even happening right now? But this is a massive conversation happening in the United States right now, despite the fact that a lot of people seem to get riled up about critical race theory, but then when you ask them what critical race theory is, no one really seems to know the answer. So for this week's episode of US 101, guys, it feels so good to say that. For this week's episode of US 101, I could have sat here and explained to you what critical race theory is, where the origin story of critical race theory, what it actually means, but I decided, you know what? I don't want to just sit here and lecture to you. I wanted to have a discussion with some friends of mine that you may know. So kick back, relax, enjoy this conversation about critical race theory, and hopefully by the end of it, you come away knowing a little bit more than you did before you started watching this episode. Joining me today, two esteemed guests who are crushing it in the history tube game, the YouTube history game right now. Of course, my first esteemed guest, you know him as Cypher. He is a fantastic historian working on his FD, aka PhD, right now. How's it going, Cypher?
Doing great.
Excellent. And then, of course, we have the most esteemed guest himself, Matt Beat, aka Mr. Beat himself. Sir, how are we doing today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
All of us are educators. All of us are teachers. Cypher, you at the collegiate level, and me and Mr. Beat at the high school level. So what is critical race theory? When you hear those terms, like, how do you define critical race theory?
A theory pertaining to law in and of itself, just like the law as it is, that the law itself is burdened with the weight of white supremacy to the point that it still is part of law today. That's kind of the main idea of what that is. Oh yeah, and it also theorizes that like it's fixable, that there's ways of reconfiguring the law so that it is no longer white supremacist. That's not how conservatives are using it, though, using the term. What they're talking about is teaching that, like, the US has been historically white supremacist, and that's not actually critical race theory. That's just it's true. That's where this really is that it's that old premise of, well, they're teaching us all the bad things about our country and not enough of the good.
It's like where systemic racism is at the heart of it, and then you're seeing where that basically the idea is that you can't escape racism when you have any institution or group of people in American society. It's kind of embedded, and so this makes it so that historians tend to focus on the more overt racism, whereas with critical race theory, it's more implicit and harder to see racism, primarily prejudices that are interlinked with our organizations and systems. So yeah, like it's not an even easy thing to define. We're having trouble defining it ourselves.
I wanted to get your guys' idea of what you thought a definition of critical race theory is first, to prove a point that, if you're not all that familiar with critical race theory, it is kind of difficult to define. So I went ahead and actually looked up the definition via the American Bar Association. Critical race theory, or CRT, is, quote, a practice of interrogating the role of race and racism in a society that emerged in the legal academy and spread to other fields of scholarship. It critiques how the social construction of race and institutionalized racism perpetuate a racial caste system that relegates people of color to the bottom tiers. CRT also recognizes that race intersects with other identities, including sexuality, gender identity, and others. CRT recognizes that racism is not a bygone relic of the past. Instead, it acknowledges that the legacy of slavery, segregation, and the imposition of second-class citizenship on Black Americans and other people of color continue to permeate the social fabric of this nation. This is an explanation of a grander history of the United States that sits beyond the quote unquote traditional your grandfather's history narrative that I'm sure all three of us got when we were in high school. Whereas critical race theory, the way that the American Bar Association is saying, is that this idea of racism is systemic in that it appears within certain systems that exist within the United States, and that it is something that continues to permeate communities of color, and that there is a discussion needed in order to help address these issues and help address how to fix these issues for generations moving forward. A lot of people, because we've talked about how mostly people on the right, mostly conservatives, are using this term as a catch-all, these buzzwords. And one of the things is that they are claiming is that CRT basically says that all white people are racist, and that it indoctrinates students to hate America and Americans and to judge people by their skin color. And you know this because there's a lot of people, primarily on the right, that will use now one quote from Martin Luther King. Y'all know which quote I'm talking about. He said it on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial.
By the color of skin.
But by the content of their character. Exactly. They're saying that critical race theory goes against everything that Martin Luther King Jr. said in his speech at the Lincoln Memorial, because now we are indoctrinating students to judge people based on their skin color, i.e., oh, you're a white person, you obviously must be evil towards people of color, which in this case is not true. Martin
Luther King never said that he wanted a post-racial society or complete color blindness. He didn't think that that was even a possibility. You know who transformed it into talking about color blindness, and specifically to get people to shut up about race in his presence and try to make especially people who were blaming him for being racist? Ronald Reagan is the primary reason why we hear so many conservatives using that quote in such an frankly incorrect way.
There has been a goal ever since Martin Luther King Jr., since the 60s, really, since the civil rights movement, to make sure laws are colorblind. But I think what critical race theory is trying to say is that that's impossible. Like, you can't, because the how our society has been made up, and this is carried by momentum of hundreds of years, going back to when slavery existed, and then even hundreds of years of slavery before that. It's like, you can't just like pass a law and then everything's going to be fine. Like, when institutions have all this momentum of history, and I always bring up the war on drugs as kind of my go-to for like how systemic racism persists. And speaking of Ronald Reagan, drug use among all different ethnic backgrounds is pretty much the same, and yet you have such a higher percentage of Black and Latino, Hispanic that are in prison because of drugs. I mean, that's a pretty simple example that shows you that we have a system that is inherently racist. It shouldn't be controversial. Even like this, just you can see this is data. This is numbers here.
I'm just wondering if all three of us will end up being accused of indoctrinating all of our students, because this year in my U.S. history classes, I went ahead and taught them about Jim Crow and Reconstruction, and the fact that the Civil War, the basis of fighting the Civil War was a war over slavery and not states' rights, and Plessy versus Ferguson, and the Pullman strike. And what else? Brown v. Board of Education, and the Little Rock Nine, and the Black Panthers, and the Black Power movement. And in some states, apparently will be going to jail for talking about all of these topics, because that is something that is happening in the United States right now, because critical race theory is such a huge talking point, primarily among conservatives right now. There are states which have now passed legislation banning critical race theory in classrooms, specifically K through 12. The state of Florida, for example, the Florida Board of Education, which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, is appointed by the governor of the state. Everyone that's on the board is appointed by the governor. So in this case, Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida. In Florida, the Board of Education has banned CRT from classrooms, and teacher instruction, quote, this is from the piece of legislation, may not define American history as something other than the creation of a new nation based largely on universal principles stated in the Declaration of Independence, end quote. There are other states that have proposed. Arizona, for example, has proposed that teachers pay a fine of $5,000 if they teach elements of critical race theory. There's a group in Nevada that is proposing that teachers wear body cameras to monitor what is being taught in classrooms. I know you're a Nevada native,
No
man,
way.
so I'm not
And
kidding.
in Nevada, by the way, it's Nevada.
Nevada. I'm sorry.
Nevadans get really angry about that.
I'm sorry about that. But this exists right now, primarily in states that lean red, states that lean conservative. You have these pieces of legislation. Texas, I know, is another state. I believe Louisiana is another state. You have these states that predominantly lean red politically that are now making it a point to take a step towards banning this idea of critical race theory. But the language in this legislation is so vague that I believe it's purposefully done that way in order to make sure that they can monitor any and all discussions happening in history classrooms, maybe even in English classrooms. Certain types of literature might not be able to read because maybe it presents a specific idea when it comes to race. One of my biggest fears is, first of all, removing the idea of autonomy from the classroom. That's one of the things that teachers enjoy the most and actually do have the most control over in terms of how they conduct their classroom. how there may be a curriculum in place and there might be lessons in place that you follow, but in terms of how you deliver those lessons is entirely up to a teacher. By being this invasive in a curriculum, you now not only take away the autonomy of a teacher in terms of how they can present their lessons, but also what it is that they're presenting to their students. Because I think a lot of parents tend to forget now that a history class is not the history that we had when we were in high school, when we were growing up, which is read the textbooks, memorize the names, memorize the dates, memorize the moments in time, quiz, repeat. You know, it was very, very rote when we took it, versus now where there's much more of an emphasis on critical thinking, on investigation. My question to you two then is, I guess, what are the pros and cons of kids that are in a classroom where you're getting a much more robust history lesson versus those that now might be in a school district where having that robust history has been taken away?
I don't think you can really be successful at hiding information from kids anymore. They're going to get it. And I think it's a little silly to think that they only learn at school when the vast majority of what they learn is outside of school. Like I've always said that if you really want somebody to turn out a decent human being when they grow up, you need to expose them to as many different types of people, as many different types of ideas, as many different types of things. So if you're going to ban critical race theory, yeah, they're going to be at a disadvantage, I guess, even though I have my own critiques of critical race theory, by the way. I think it's there's lots of valid criticisms of it. I just don't see it. Like they're still going to be all like they have these, come on, like what are we really going to be like? You can't stop the information age. So good luck to you. This is why, like, I keep saying I'm not afraid of any these measures. It's too late. The cat's been out of the bag for at least 20 years. Like Sammy and I, we were in high school, like at the early years of the internet, you know, so we remember like how hard it was to get information back then, going to a library, looking at index cards. Like it's not just good luck if you want to try to censor and indoctrinate our kids. Good luck to you.
My other concern, though, is by shielding students from certain sources and shielding students from certain information, the information that they will end up seeking based on what it is they're learning in that class is still not going to be the full picture, because they're basing their searches on what they might be hearing in classrooms. You know what I'm saying? It's because I feel like in a classroom setting, a lot of us tend, I mean, as teachers, as educators, we are delivering information to students, and we are delivering ways to help them understand how to read that information, how to understand that information that they are seeking out. My concern is if you remove a more robust history lesson from the class, or if you remove certain pieces of work that you can't read within an English classroom, yeah, they might go out and find that information accidentally, but they're not going to be driven to finding a much deeper understanding of that information if it's not first being made available or being put at top of mind in a classroom. You know what I'm saying? It's one of these things where as teachers, since we're allowed and able to expose them to parts of history that they might not have been all that familiar with at the beginning, what I feel that does is, now that they know that information, then they're able to go out and find that information, that deeper information on their own. If you're telling teachers you can't teach about racism, you can't teach about Hulk or redlining, you can't teach about the Tuskegee experiments, you can't, like, none of that stuff, you deprive your students of giving them that opportunity to go and search for that information on their own, because they've not heard about it. And if they're not hearing about it in their home and they're not hearing about it in school, the likelihood of them searching that out on their own is probably significantly less.
There's a number of times that I'll bring up something that it's like something that I literally teach in the classroom, and it's like, and people are surprised that, you know, it's never been taught before. I mean, like, and that goes well beyond just because God, the number of times I have had people say like, you forgot to mention X, and it's like that's not the point. You can actually go out and find more. That's the point. I'm not here to mention everything, and that shouldn't be the case for teachers either. But in terms of high school history, you can't necessarily expect students to go out and find this stuff on their own. It might lodge in their brain, and 5 years down the line and go like, well, what was Mr. Beat talking about? That I remember him saying something like that, and then it goes, and then they go like that. But like, especially in high school, you've got to have more directed learning. When people are trying to outlaw certain parts of the curriculum, what they're doing is depriving those students of that that little thing that you're lodging in their brain for them to look up for themselves 5 years down the line. And it's not just because I've seen people on Twitter when I've talked about these kinds of things, who are instantly like, well, that sucks for Florida. Floridians are just are going to just be worse educated now. And it's like, true, but the idea spreads, as we're already seeing. But two, Floridians are still Americans. One of us getting a worse education hurts us all. This is something that isn't just, oh, well, they don't know all the facets of Jim Crow now, so I guess they can't really talk about Jim Crow, but it hurts the national conversation. It hurts our very citizenship.
I feel like the critical race theory critics, we are saying stuff that they want us to say. What I mean by that is, well, we're defending teaching certain things in the classroom, but what we're defending is not what they're arguing against. Like, remember, critical race theory for the critics are mostly attacking a straw man. It's a straw man fallacy. They're attacking like, well, they're trying to teach us all that we're racist. Like, white people are born racist and they'll always be racist, and so white people will always be bad. That's essentially this big straw man they're attacking. But what we have been doing the last few minutes is we've been teaching about the history of racism, which is not controversial at all in the 21st century. Like, everybody needs to know the history of racism. And we also all need to know, which surprisingly, a lot of people don't realize this, that the whole concept of race was only invented 550 years ago. Like, it's a blip in all of history. Like, this whole idea, the social construct of race, I do get like the impulse to say, you're focusing on the group. This is like actually, you can have really good debates between like individualism and collectivism. Like, I love those debates. And the impulse for the individualist crowd is like, why you always got to lump us into groups? You're pitting us. And I used to be that way as a younger man. I used to kind of have a more simple-minded approach, like just ignore all this stuff. It's all socially constructed anyway. You can't ignore it. If you want to learn history, you just can't ignore it. And so, like, I just want to be clear, like, we're not falling for your trap, okay? Critical race theory critics, like, we are arguing that you should teach the history of racism.
Yes, it's always going to be a straw man, whether it be CRT or patriotic education or anything along those lines. What they're really attacking is the realization that like these are problems that continue. It's not about teaching hatred for the country or anything. It's about honestly appraising the problems that we have. It's that difference that honest difference between nationalism and patriotism. Nationalism is blind to the country's faults, whereas patriotism is facing those faults and still coming away saying like this is a good country.
So then ultimately, what is the big take? What should be the big takeaway of this big conversation? We've been talking for, I don't even know how long anymore, but what should be the big takeaway so that everyone's fears can be assuaged, everybody can just relax and we can move on to the next big buzzword controversy that will probably hit us in about October. So, I mean, let's put a pin in it, gentlemen. Let's solve the national crisis and let's let people know what it is they need to know so that they can shush and we can enjoy the rest of our summer in peace.
I think I say that I've said this on many different in different videos. So if you've seen this watching, I'm sorry if I'm repetitive, but media literacy is I think the most important and critical part of this, because like it doesn't matter. There's so much content I don't know as a history teacher. Like I'm not really an expert on any history. I like American political history a lot, but it doesn't mean I know everything about that. We have our specialties, but there's so much history we don't know. All we can hope for is we know that we can be academics in terms of like we can study like historians, study history like historians, like know how to navigate the information, how to interpret it, how to analyze it, how to evaluate, how to basically form original thoughts and determine if claims are completely true, mostly true, partially true, or not true at all. It's not, and it's a claim. It's like it's always approaching a new claim with skepticism. Doesn't mean that you don't believe anything. Like, I don't believe anything the freaking elites say. No, it just means that you're not automatically going to believe something just because one source told you that. And you can still, I think, this can be taught at a young age. I have 2 elementary school daughters, and they already, I think, are capable of navigating different media literacy problems we see are not with younger people. I think it's with old people like me and older who never taught media literacy growing up, and I had to learn it on my own. And when I say learn it on my own, no disrespect to teachers. I've taught for 12 years, and no disrespect to you guys. Thank you for your service. But most people learn most things on their own. And so that's my takeaway.
The biggest takeaway for me would be that, like, this is nothing new. This is the same old conversation we've been having for at least 40 years about class curriculums, and it really comes back to we used to have a consensus back in the 1950s, but what broke that consensus was the realization that there's problems with it. This idea of ever-present progress, and the country is might have some things to pick up, but like there's nothing fundamentally flawed with the country. Broke apart in the 1950s because, well, Jim Crow broke apart, and we've been struggling with that legacy ever since. I remember reading stuff from the 1919 Red Scare where people were complaining about Bolshevism in the classroom. And this is before standardized curriculums. This cycle of the new boogeyman currently is CRT. The last one was the 1619 project. We've had these kinds of things. I mean, like the one time the actual history profession tried to step in the 1990s was with the National Standard, and that got beaten down with the whole they're teaching us that we're racists, how dare they. 30 or 40 years ago, most people weren't being taught the lost cause, for instance, either. Certainly in the South they were, but like by that time the lost cause had basically evaporated in the North, and that was something that was quite the ideological underpinning of Jim Crow. Those kinds of things being defeated in that is what people are ultimately wanting to bring back, because I mean there is something comforting about like the lost cause or anything along those lines, where it's like, no, we didn't fight over slavery, we fought over fundamental differences in region and economic traits. It was a battle. The Civil War was about a battle of gentlemen. It's comforting. It's a comforting myth that helps people like not grapple with the fundamental problems of our country.
I think it's also white guilt, though, too. Sorry, I just it's
No,
popular.
please, go ahead.
Like I've seen with people I know in my life, they're like, all this stuff happened so long ago. What does this have to do with me? And they don't want to feel that white guilt. And so like what did I do? And so I think the part of the problem is the messaging. I think that we shouldn't make people feel guilty just for their skin color. That's something we should actively fight against. So I think how we go about teaching the history of racism is we got to be careful how we do it. And I think many history teachers have not done a good job with that, because if we have a certain segment of the population right now, it's like my cousin who lived, this is my imaginary cousin, who lives in a trailer, and like has struggled his entire life, and like, how do I have white privilege? Like, I understand that. So messaging is important.
In the classroom, we don't need to use terms like white privilege and that, that's more of a term that you'll see in books and whatnot, not something that you need to teach specifically. It's more that you need to teach what white privilege is, rather than like the specific terms. That absolutely needs to be taught, especially in high school, where we need to say like there is a privileged class here, and that doesn't mean that like it negates the people who have struggled their entire lives. I remember when I was severely in debt and had no job prospects, and looking at like, do I have to move back in with my parents? But like the fact that I even had the ability to move in with my parents is a privilege in and of itself. That kind of realization is difficult for people, but necessary to create a more informed public. Yeah, I don't think it's possible to peel back that progress like people want, but it is possible to silence the teaching of these things temporarily. And that's the thing that we need to ultimately fight here.
And that is it for this episode of US 101. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you guys so much for hanging out with me this week. Really do appreciate it. And a very special shout out to Cypher and Mr. Beat for taking part in that conversation. Our conversation was actually a lot longer. It was about an hour and some change. We were talking about this. I had to edit it down so that, it didn't take forever for the point is, it's a much longer conversation that we had. And likewise, hopefully this topic, prompts you to have a longer conversation about it as well. And guys, I cannot tell you how much I have missed doing this, how much I have missed talking to you guys, making these videos. I can't, it was my first year of teaching high school, so I stepped away for a year so that I could focus on that, focus on my craft, focus on getting the rhythm of teaching somewhat under my feet. Now that I've got summer vacation available, now that I've got a year of teaching under my belt, I'm no longer that rookie teacher. I'm hoping to bring more US 101 to you on a regular basis, not just in the summertime, but throughout the entire year. Thank you guys so much for your patience and for your understanding and for your continued support for this channel. I cannot do this without you. You guys are the lifeblood of US 101. And as always, if you guys want to connect with me, links down below in the description box. You can hit me up on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook if you want to, all those links down below. Guys, I will see you soon for another episode of US 101, which is actually going to take us on the road, because for my next episode, it's going to be a walking tour of a very famous home in the United States, because I'm actually going on vacation to the East Coast pretty soon, and I figure I'll take the camera and we'll make an episode out of it. So you'll see that in the very near future. But until then, guys, I am all done. Did you guys see my glasses? I'm getting old, guys.